Security, get him out. Now. Rachel Whitmore didn't raise her voice, but the command landed like a verdict, sharp enough to cut through the glass-walled boardroom and freeze every executive in place as all eyes turned toward the man sitting at the far end of the table, Malik Thompson, who hadn't moved an inch, not when she spoke, not when the room shifted, not even when two security officers stepped forward with measured confidence, their footsteps echoing across polished marble like a countdown. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Malik. He sat in a plain black t-shirt and dark denim. No logo, no flash, no signal of wealth, just a quiet presence that didn't beg to be noticed yet somehow commanded the entire room without effort, his eyes steady, unreadable, as if he had already seen how this would end. Rachel folded her arms, her expression sharpened by certainty. You don't look like someone who moves millions, she added, her tone light, but edged with dismissal. And a few people around the table let out restrained laughs, the kind that lingered just long enough to make a point. Malik didn't respond immediately, and that silence stretched, not awkward but deliberate, like he was letting the room reveal itself fully before saying a single word. In the corner, a junior intern named Sophie Lane hesitated, then slowly raised her phone, something in her instinct telling her this moment mattered, that this wasn't just another meeting gone sideways. One of the security officers reached Malik and placed a firm hand on the back of his chair, not aggressive, just final, like the decision had already been made for him. Still, Malik didn't stand. He looked at Rachel, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with something colder, something measured. Are you sure this is your final decision? He asked, his voice calm, almost quiet, but it cut through the room more effectively than any raised tone could have. Rachel didn't hesitate. Absolutely, she replied, already turning, slightly as if the conversation was beneath her time. That was when Malik finally stood, smooth, unhurried, as if he controlled the pace of the room itself, brushing off the moment without resistance, without protest, and as he stepped away from the table, he paused just long enough to say one sentence, low but unmistakable. You didn't reject me. You rejected your future. The laughter disappeared instantly. Even the air seemed to shift, like something invisible had just cracked beneath the surface. But Rachel waved it off, dismissing the weight of his words with a small scoff. Escort him out. Malik walked toward the door on his own terms. No rush, no tension. Just a quiet exit that felt less like removal and more like departure. And as the glass doors closed behind him with a soft click, the room returned to motion, conversations restarting, chairs shifting, as if nothing significant had just happened, as if they hadn't just turned away something they didn't understand. But outside, in the reflection of the city skyline stretching across the glass, Malik paused for a moment, pulling out his phone, his expression unchanged, and with a single, precise motion, he made a call that would not raise voices, would not cause a scene, but would begin something far more powerful, something the people in that room wouldn't feel until it was already too late. The door had barely finished closing behind Malik when the room exhaled, like tension had permission to disappear the second he was gone, and Rachel Whitmore adjusted her blazer with a small, satisfied motion, reclaiming control of a space she believed had briefly slipped from her grasp. Let us move on, she said, her tone crisp, efficient, already dismissing the moment as insignificant, and the executives followed her lead. Laptops reopening, presentations resuming, numbers returning to the screen as if nothing of value had just walked out. But not everyone moved on. In the far corner, Sophie Lane lowered her phone slowly, her eyes still fixed on the glass doors where Malik had disappeared. Something about his stillness, his certainty, refusing to settle in her mind as ordinary, and beside her, a junior analyst. Named Kevin muttered under his breath. That guy did not act like someone who just got rejected. But Rachel cut through the room again. Focus, she said, sharper now, sensing distraction. We have real investors to deal with. Outside, Malik stood in the quiet hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching below in sharp afternoon light, cars moving like patterns on a screen, unaware that decisions made above them would soon ripple outward, and he did not rush, did not pace, did not show even a hint of frustration. Instead, he looked at his phone for a brief second before placing it to his ear. "It is done," he said, his voice calm, measured, as if confirming something already expected. On the other end, a woman's voice responded immediately, precise and prepared. "Understood. Do you want full activation?" Malik's gaze shifted slightly toward the skyline, reflecting back at him in the glass. "Phase 1. He replied. And that was all. No raised tone, no explanation, just a quiet instruction that carried more weight than anything spoken in that boardroom. "Initiating now," she answered. Back inside, Rachel continued presenting, her confidence rebuilding with every slide, every nod from the table reinforcing her authority. "We have secured alternative funding options," she said, unaware that at that exact moment, one of those options was being withdrawn, quietly, systematically, without announcement. Across town, in a different office, screens began to change, numbers recalculating, approvals shifting to pending, then to denied, not because of error, but because a different decision had been made at a higher level, one Rachel had never considered existed. Malik ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if he had simply completed a routine task. And for a moment he stood there in silence, the reflection of the city merging with his own, until a memory flickered through his mind, not loud, not overwhelming, but clear enough to shape everything that followed. A younger version of himself sitting across from a banker who never looked him in the eye, hearing the words, "Not the right fit," despite numbers that said otherwise, despite proof that should have been enough. And now, years later, the language had changed, the setting had changed, but the message had felt the same. Malik did not close his eyes, did not react outwardly, but something in his gaze hardened just slightly. Not anger, not bitterness, but clarity, the kind that comes from seeing a pattern too many times to ignore. Back in the boardroom, a notification appeared on one executive's screen, then another, small at first, easy to dismiss, until Kevin frowned and leaned forward. "That is strange," he murmured, and Rachel glanced over, irritation flickering. "What is it?" she asked, expecting something minor, something manageable, but Kevin hesitated for half a second too long before answering. One of the funding lines just went into review, and Rachel's expression shifted, just slightly, not concern yet, but something close to it, because somewhere deep beneath her confidence, something did not feel as controlled as it had just moments ago. The room did not explode into panic, not yet, but something invisible had shifted, like a crack forming beneath polished marble that no one could see, but everyone could feel. And Rachel Whitmore stood still for just a fraction longer than she intended, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked toward Kevin's screen. "It is probably a routine review," she said, her voice steady, controlled. But the certainty from minutes ago was no longer as solid, and Kevin did not immediately agree, which was unusual, because Kevin always agreed. "It is not flagged as routine," he replied carefully, scrolling, his fingers slowing as more data populated in front of him. "It is marked as external trigger." That phrase landed differently. Rachel straightened, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the floor with more urgency now. "Triggered by who?" she asked, expecting a name she recognized. A competitor, a minor stakeholder, something predictable, something manageable. But Kevin hesitated again, and that hesitation pulled the attention of the entire table back into the moment they had just tried to leave behind. "It does not say," he admitted. "It just says priority override." Around the table, posture shifted, shoulders tightening, eyes flicking between screens, because in this room, people understood one thing very clearly. Money did not just pause without a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was already in motion. Rachel forced a small exhale, regaining composure. "Then we find out," she said, sharper now, reclaiming authority through tone, if not certainty. "Contact the fund directly." Across the table, another executive, Daniel Reeves, already dialing, nodded. "On it," he said, putting the call on speaker, the ring echoing through the room louder than it should have. Louder because everyone was listening, because everyone needed it to be simple. One ring, two rings. Then a voice answered, professional, neutral. "Investment relations. How can I assist you?" Daniel spoke quickly, confidently. "This is Daniel Reeves from Whitmore Capital. We are seeing a hold on our funding line. We need clarification immediately. A pause, brief but noticeable, as if something was being checked on the other end. Then the voice returned, still calm, but more measured now. "One moment, please." Silence filled the boardroom again, thicker this time, not empty but loaded, and Rachel's jaw tightened slightly as she crossed her arms, her mind moving faster than her expression allowed, calculating, adjusting, refusing to believe this was anything more than a temporary disruption. But then the line came back, and the tone had changed, not dramatic, not emotional, just final. "That account is currently under executive review. All activity has been paused until further notice." Daniel blinked. Executive review by whom? He pressed, and this time the answer did not come immediately. When it did, it was slower, deliberate. "That information is not available at your level." The words hung in the air like a door closing somewhere far above them, somewhere none of them had access to. And for the first time, Rachel did not have an immediate response, not because she did not want to speak, but because she did not have control over the situation anymore, not in the way she thought she did. "Escalated," she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled, more dangerous in its precision. "We need to speak to whoever authorized this." On the other end, there was another pause, then a response that was polite but immovable. "That request has already been logged. You will be contacted." The call ended before Daniel could reply. No one spoke for a moment, not because they did not have questions, but because they all felt the same realization forming at the same time. Something had moved above them, something they had not seen coming, something that did not need their permission to act. Kevin swallowed, glancing back at his screen as more alerts appeared. "It is not just one line," he said quietly. "Two more just shifted to review." Rachel turned sharply. "That is not possible," she snapped. But even as she said it, she knew it was happening, because the evidence was right in front of her, updating in real time, unstoppable, indifferent to her disbelief. And somewhere outside that building, beyond the glass and steel and carefully controlled environments, Malik Thompson was no longer in the hallway, no longer even in sight. But the decision he had set in motion was moving through systems, through people, through structures Rachel had never questioned, and it was only just beginning to be felt. The silence after the call did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like pressure building beneath a surface that still looked calm. And Rachel Whitmore stood at the head of the table with her arms still crossed. But now her posture carried something different, not uncertainty yet, but resistance to something she could not fully define. "This does not change anything," she said, her voice firm, measured, trying to anchor the room back to her control. "We have contingencies." But even as she spoke, another notification appeared, then another, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that no one in that room could ignore anymore. Kevin leaned forward again, his eyes scanning faster now. "Another one just locked," he said, quieter this time, like he was not sure he should be the one delivering the news. And Daniel turned toward him sharply. "How many total?" Kevin hesitated for half a second, then answered, "4 funding lines are now under review, all within the last 10 minutes. That number landed differently. For was not a coincidence. For was not routine. Rachel's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the meeting began, she did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the main screen, her reflection faintly visible in the glass behind it, layered over the city skyline that now felt further away than it had an hour ago. "Pull up the investor distribution," she said, her tone lower, more focused, less performative and more precise, because now this was not about image, this was about exposure. Kevin obeyed quickly, bringing up the data, columns of names, percentages, structures, and for a moment, everything looked as it should, diversified, balanced, secure. But then he paused. "Wait," he said, his voice tightening, and Rachel turned sharply. "What is it?" He pointed at the screen. "These 4 lines, they are not independent." The room stilled again. "Explain," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Kevin swallowed, then continued. "They all trace back to a parent structure, layered through different funds, different shells, but they consolidate at the top." He zoomed in, fingers moving carefully now, like he understood the weight of what he was uncovering. And as the structure expanded on the screen, the room leaned in without realizing it, drawn towards something none of them had expected to see. "Who is at the top?" Daniel asked, his voice no longer casual, no longer confident, but edged with something closer to concern. Kevin did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the screen, double-checking, then checking again, as if hoping the data would change if he looked long enough. "It is restricted," he said finally, and that word carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Rachel stepped closer, her heels stopping just inches from the screen. "Nothing in our structure is restricted from us," she said sharply, rejecting the implication outright. But Kevin shook his head slightly. "This is not our structure," he replied, and that distinction shifted everything. Across the table, someone exhaled slowly, and another executive leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen like it might reveal more if he looked hard enough. Rachel's mind was moving fast now, recalculating, connecting pieces that had not seemed related before, the timing, the trigger, the silence from the other end of the call, and then, without warning, a memory surfaced, not from years ago, not distant, but from less than an hour earlier, a man sitting calmly at the end of this very table, asking one question with absolute clarity. "Are you sure this is your final decision?" Rachel blinked once, the connection forming whether she wanted it to or not, and she turned slightly, scanning the room, as if someone else might say it first, might confirm what she was beginning to understand. But no one did, because no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Kevin finally spoke again, quieter now, but every word landing with precision. "Whoever controls this structure controls a significant portion of our liquidity." The implication settled over the room like a shadow. Rachel straightened slowly, her composure still intact on the surface, but beneath it, something had shifted permanently, something she could not reverse with a command or a tone or a decision, because whatever had been set in motion was already beyond her reach, already moving through systems she did not own, through authority she did not command, and for the first time since that man had walked into her boardroom, Rachel Whitmore was no longer certain she had been the one in control. No one in the room spoke for several seconds, not because they did not understand what Kevin had just revealed, but because they understood it too well, and Rachel Whitmore remained still in front of the screen, her reflection now barely noticeable against the expanding structure that dominated the display, a structure that no longer looked like a network she controlled, but something far more layered, far more deliberate. "Find the access point," she said finally, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, replaced with precision, because she knew instinctively that this was no longer about managing perception, this was about survival. Kevin nodded quickly, his fingers moving again, digging deeper, bypassing surface-level permissions, trying to trace the origin of authority within the system, but the deeper he went, the less familiar it became, and that alone was enough to shift the mood of the entire room. "This is not standard architecture," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Whoever built this did not want to be seen. Daniel leaned forward, his confidence now replaced with urgency. "Everyone can be seen if you go high enough," he said, as if repeating something he had always believed, but Kevin did not respond to that, because the screen in front of him was proving otherwise. "There is a lock at the top," Kevin said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on a restricted segment of the structure. "It is not just encrypted, it is controlled access, meaning only one or two individuals can authorize visibility." Rachel turned slightly, her posture still composed, but her mind now moving at a different speed, faster, sharper, connecting pieces she had not considered minutes ago. The timing, the trigger, the immediate cascade across multiple funding lines, and then the memory returned again, clearer this time, not just the man's words, but his presence, his stillness, his refusal to react the way most people would. "Pull the access logs," she said, and Kevin did not hesitate, bringing up a new layer of data, timestamps, entries, system interactions, and there it was, a single activation point, clean, precise, recent. 10 minutes ago, Kevin said, his voice tightening again. One command initiated the entire sequence. The room seemed to contract around that statement, because one command meant one source, and one source meant intention. Rachel stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the timestamp, calculating backward without needing to say it out loud. 10 minutes ago was the moment he left the room. No one said his name, but it was there, unspoken, hovering between them. Daniel was the first to break. "That is not possible," he said quickly, almost reflexively. He was just an investor. He did not even present credentials. But even as he spoke, the argument felt weaker, because the system in front of them was not reacting to appearance, it was reacting to authority. Kevin exhaled slowly, still staring at the restricted access point. "Whoever this is, they did not need to present anything," he said quietly. The system already knew them. That line settled deeper than anything else. Rachel did not move for a moment, and then she turned slightly, looking around the table, not for answers, but for alignment, for someone to confirm that this could still be controlled, still be reversed, still be contained. But no one offered it, because they all saw the same thing she did, a structure that was not theirs, a command that did not require their approval, and consequences already unfolding in real time. "We contact the board," Rachel said, her voice steady again. But this time the steadiness came from necessity, not confidence. "Now." Daniel nodded immediately, already reaching for his phone, while Kevin continued to monitor the screen, watching as another alert appeared, then another, each one confirming what they were all beginning to understand. This was not a glitch, not a delay, not a misunderstanding. This was execution. Across the city, in a quiet office several floors above a different skyline, Malik Thompson stood by a window, his reflection merging with the fading light of the afternoon, his phone resting calmly in his hand, and behind him, a team worked without noise, without panic, just precise movements, confirming actions, verifying locks, tracking outcomes. Phase 1 complete. The same voice from earlier said, steady and efficient, and Malik gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the city below. "Proceed to Phase 2, he replied, his tone unchanged, because for him, this was not escalation, it was continuation, a sequence that had already been decided long before he ever walked into that boardroom. Back inside Whitmore Capital, the call to the board had just begun, voices on the other end already tense, already aware that something had shifted beyond their immediate control, and as Rachel stood there listening, absorbing, recalculating, one truth began to settle beneath everything else. The man she had dismissed less than an hour ago had not needed to argue, had not needed to prove himself, because his power had never been in that room. It had always been above it, waiting for the moment he chose to use it. The call with the board did not begin with greetings. It began with tension already in motion, voices overlapping, questions forming before answers could exist, and Rachel Whitmore stood at the center of it, her phone on speaker, her posture still upright, but now held together by control rather than confidence. "We are seeing multiple funding interruptions," one board member said immediately, his tone sharp, already aware this was not isolated. "Explain what is happening." Rachel did not rush her response. She did not allow urgency to break her rhythm. "We are investigating an external override affecting several liquidity channels," she said, her voice measured, professional, but the phrasing itself revealed something deeper, something she would never have admitted an hour ago. This was not internal. This was not within her command. On the other end, a second voice entered, calmer but heavier. "External override requires top-tier authorization," he said. "Who has that level of access?" The question landed directly, and for a moment Rachel did not answer, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and saying it out loud would make it real in a way she could not take back. Kevin glanced at her, then back at the screen, watching as another indicator shifted from active to restricted, and he spoke before she could, his voice careful but undeniable. "We have traced the control structure. It consolidates at a single authority point." Silence followed on the line, not empty, but loaded, as if every person listening was recalculating at the same time. "Name," the board member said finally, his tone no longer questioning, but demanding clarity. Kevin hesitated, because even now, the system did not display it openly. It was hidden behind layered permissions, but there was enough there to understand the scale, enough to understand the intent. "The identity is restricted," Kevin said, choosing precision over assumption. "But whoever it is, they are not just an investor. They are a controlling entity." That phrase shifted the entire dynamic of the call. Rachel's grip tightened slightly around the edge of the table, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for those closest to notice. Because controlling entity did not operate on the same level as negotiation, it operated on ownership. Then escalate to them, Rachel said quickly, reclaiming direction through action. We need direct communication now. On the other end, there was a pause, then a response that carried something Rachel had not heard before, not resistance, but caution. If they initiated this without contact, it means they chose not to engage, the voice said. And that usually means this is not a negotiation. That sentence settled into the room like a weight. Around the table, no one moved. No one interrupted. Because they all understood what that meant. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the shift happening high above it. But inside that boardroom, the perception of control had begun to fracture completely. Kevin refreshed the system again, and this time, something new appeared, not a warning, not a lock, but a notification tied directly to the core structure. There is an update, he said quietly, and Rachel turned instantly. What kind of update? Kevin leaned closer, reading carefully, because this was different. This was not automated. This was deliberate. It is a scheduled board intervention, he said, his voice tightening. Time stamped for this morning. Immediate effect. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Scheduled by who? She asked, even though part of her already knew the answer would not be simple. Kevin did not respond immediately. He scrolled, cross-checked, then finally spoke. Authorized by primary stakeholder. That term carried finality. Not investor. Not partner. Stakeholder. The highest level of influence within the structure. The room fell completely still, and for the first time, no one tried to fill the silence. Because they all understood what had just been confirmed. The person behind this was not reacting. They were executing a plan that had already been prepared. Across the city, Malik Thompson stood in the same quiet space, his phone lighting up briefly before dimming again, and behind him, the same calm voice spoke. Phase 2 is active. Board intervention confirmed. Malik did not turn, did not react outwardly, but there was a slight shift in his expression, not satisfaction, not anger, just acknowledgement. Good, he said simply, because for him, this was not about retaliation, it was about correction, about resetting a system that had revealed its own weakness the moment it underestimated him. Back in the boardroom, Rachel finally spoke again, her voice lower now, stripped of performance. Prepare for full board review, she said, because even she understood now, whatever was coming next was no longer something she could control, only something she would have to face. The room did not move when Rachel Whitmore gave the order. It absorbed it. Like everyone understood that whatever came next was no longer routine, no longer procedural, but something heavier, something that would define more than just a quarterly outcome. And she stood there with her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture still composed but no longer effortless, because control now required effort. Full board review in 30 minutes. Daniel confirmed after ending the call, his voice tight, efficient, already shifting into damage containment. And around the table laptops were turned, messages sent, assistants alerted, but beneath the activity there was something else, something quieter, something closer to realization. Kevin did not look away from the screen, because the system was still moving, still updating, still revealing pieces of a structure that had been invisible until it was too late to ignore. There is more, he said, and Rachel turned immediately. What now? Her tone was sharp again, but this time it was driven by urgency, not authority. Kevin zoomed further into the restricted layer, and for the first time, a partial identifier appeared, not a full name, not a profile, just a reference tag tied to ownership rights. Primary stakeholder designation confirmed, he read carefully. Voting power, 38%. The number hit the room like a quiet shock, because that level of control was not passive, it was decisive. It was enough to redirect outcomes, to halt operations, to reshape the entire structure without consensus. That is not possible, Daniel said under his breath, but no one echoed him this time, because the data was not asking for belief, it was presenting fact. Rachel stepped closer again, her eyes locked on the number, recalculating everything she thought she knew about her own company, her own position, her own authority. 38% did not appear overnight. 38% was built, acquired, structured over time, hidden in plain sight until the moment it mattered. How did we not see this? She asked, not to anyone specific, But the question carried weight, because in that moment it was no longer about the external threat, it was about internal blindness. Kevin answered quietly, still focused on the screen. Because it was never meant to be seen at this level, he said. It is layered through multiple entities, each one below reporting thresholds, each one compliant individually. But together, he paused, then finished. Together they control everything. The room absorbed that sentence slowly, because it rewrote the past in real time. Every deal, every approval, every assumption of control now standing on something far less stable than they had believed. Rachel straightened slightly, forcing clarity back into her posture, because even now, even here, she refused to collapse into reaction. "We prepare our position," she said, her voice steady again. But this time steadiness came from discipline, not confidence. "If this is a board intervention, then we respond at the board level." Kevin nodded, but his eyes did not leave the screen, because something else had just appeared, something different from alerts, different from restrictions. "There is a meeting authorization," he said slowly, and Rachel's focus snapped back. "What kind of authorization?" Kevin read carefully, every word landing with precision. "Executive presence required. Primary stakeholder attending in person." The room froze again, not with confusion this time, but with anticipation. Because this was no longer abstract, no longer hidden behind systems and structures. This was becoming visible, physical, undeniable. Rachel did not speak immediately. She did not need to. Because in her mind, the image had already formed, a man sitting at the end of this very table, calm, unshaken, asking one question that now echoed differently, not as a challenge, but as a warning. "Are you sure this is your final decision?" Across the city, Malik Thompson adjusted the cuff of his jacket, the simple black t-shirt replaced now with a tailored suit that fit him with quiet precision, and in the reflection of the glass beside him, he looked exactly like what he had always been, not an investor seeking approval, not a guest asking for access, but a man who owned the outcome before anyone else realized there was a decision to be made. Behind him, the same calm voice spoke again, "Boardroom is ready." Malik gave a slight nod, his expression unchanged, because for him, this was not escalation, it was arrival, and as he reached for the door, the sequence that had begun in silence was about to be completed in full view, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more powerful. Truth revealed at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. The boardroom did not feel the same when they reassembled, not because the furniture had changed or the skyline outside had shifted, but because every person walking back into that space carried a different weight than they had just an hour earlier. And Rachel Whitmore took her place at the head of the table without hesitation, but not without awareness, because now every chair in that room represented more than a role. It represented a position that could be challenged, replaced, or erased. No one spoke immediately. Laptops were open, screens glowing. But the usual pre-meeting chatter was gone, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate, almost respectful, like the room itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Kevin sat slightly forward, eyes locked on the system interface still open in front of him, watching for any additional movement, any new signal that might explain what was coming. But for the first time since the sequence began, the system was quiet, not inactive, but waiting. Rachel noticed it too. "Nothing new?" she asked, her voice controlled, neutral, but the question carried a deeper layer, because silence now meant intention, not absence. Kevin shook his head slightly. "No new changes," he replied. "Everything is holding." That word settled differently. Holding meant the system was not reacting anymore. It was positioned. Around the table, the board members exchanged brief glances, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge what none of them wanted to say first. Whoever had initiated this had already made their move, and now they were waiting for something else to happen. "Then we wait," Rachel said, her tone firm again, reclaiming rhythm. But even as she spoke, the doors at the far end of the boardroom made a soft, controlled sound as they opened. Every head turned at once, not because of noise, but because of timing. Malik Thompson stepped inside without urgency, without hesitation, dressed now in a tailored suit that fit him with quiet precision, his presence filling the room not through volume, but through certainty, and for a moment, no one moved, Because recognition did not come as a shock. It came as confirmation of something they had already begun to understand. Rachel did not stand. She did not speak. She held her position, her gaze fixed on him, because whatever this was, she would meet it directly. Malik walked forward at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, just controlled, his eyes moving across the table once, acknowledging each face without needing to stop, until he reached the seat at the head opposite Rachel, the seat no one had occupied yet, and he placed his hand lightly on the back of the chair before speaking. "You called for a board review," he said, his voice calm, even, but it carried through the room with clarity that did not require volume. "I am here." The statement landed differently than anything else spoken that day, because it did not ask permission, it did not request validation, it established presence. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, uncertainty now visible where confidence had been. Earlier, while Kevin's eyes moved quickly between Malik and the system, as if trying to align the person in front of him with the structure on his screen, Rachel finally spoke, her tone measured, deliberate. "You were not invited to this meeting," she said, not as a question, but as a boundary, one she was trying to reassert. Malik met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "I do not need an invitation," he replied, and then, with a small motion, he pulled the chair back and sat down, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, like he had always belonged there. The room did not react outwardly, but the shift was immediate, because in that moment, the abstract control they had been discussing became real, visible, undeniable. Kevin's screen flickered once, a subtle update that drew his attention instantly, and his voice came out lower than before, almost careful. "Primary stakeholder, presence confirmed," he said, reading directly from the system. The words echoed in the silence that followed, not loud, but absolute. Rachel did not look at the screen. She did not need to. She looked at Malik, and for the first time since this began, she asked a question that carried more than authority. It carried acknowledgement. "Who are you?" Malik did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, not to create tension, but because the answer itself would change everything. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, precise, and impossible to misunderstand. "The one you chose to underestimate." The room did not move. No one interrupted, because the meaning behind those words had already been proven before he ever said them. And now, sitting at that table, he was no longer a possibility, no longer a question. He was the answer they had been trying to avoid since the moment he walked in the first time. No one rushed to speak after Malik's words settled into the room, not because they lacked response, but because anything said too quickly would feel smaller than the truth already standing in front of them. And Rachel Whitmore held his gaze for a moment longer than she intended, measuring him, recalculating him, trying to align the man she had dismissed with the authority now confirmed on every screen around her. "Then clarify your position," she said finally, her voice steady again. But now it carried a different tone, not dismissal, not control, but precision, because she understood now that this was no longer about asserting power. It was about understanding it. Malik leaned back slightly in his chair, not in relaxation, but in control of space, his posture deliberate, composed, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, unchanged from the moment he first entered that building. "My position has been clear," he said. "I hold controlling interest through layered acquisition structures that your compliance team approved without ever seeing the full picture." Kevin's fingers tightened slightly over the keyboard as he heard that, because it confirmed what the system had already shown, but hearing it spoken made it undeniable. Daniel shifted again, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier confidence. "You are saying you built this inside our own structure," he said, and Malik did not hesitate. "No," he replied. "I built it above your structure." That distinction landed heavier than anything else, because above meant beyond their reach, beyond their visibility, beyond their control. Around the table, no one laughed, no one challenged, because the evidence was already in front of them, the locked funding lines, the restricted access, the board intervention they had not initiated. Rachel straightened slightly, her mind moving quickly, because even now, even here, she was not someone who retreated from pressure, she adapted to it. "And what exactly do you want?" she asked, her tone direct, because in her world, Power always moved toward outcome. Malik looked at her for a moment, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with something more measured, something closer to clarity. "This is not about what I want," he said. "It is about what you set in motion." The words were quiet, but they carried weight, because they redirected the entire narrative back to the moment everything had shifted. Rachel's expression tightened slightly, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to notice, because she knew exactly which moment he meant. "You were removed from a meeting," she replied, controlled, deliberate, based on incomplete presentation. Malik's eyes did not move from hers. "No," he said calmly. "I was removed based on assumption." The room absorbed that in silence. Kevin glanced briefly at Sophie in the corner, who still held her phone, though now lowered, her expression caught between tension and realization, because she had seen it happen in real time. The dismissal, the tone, the certainty that had not been based on data. Malik continued, not raising his voice, not changing his pace. "You did not ask for credentials. You did not request verification. You made a decision in less than 30 seconds based on how I looked and how I chose to present myself." Rachel opened her mouth slightly, ready to respond, but paused, because every word he said was not accusation, it was fact, and facts were harder to dismiss. "This is a business environment," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter now. "We assess risk quickly." Malik nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "And that is exactly why this is happening," he replied. "Because you assess people the same way you assess numbers, quickly, without full context, assuming you already understand the outcome." The room did not move. No one interrupted. Because what he was describing was not unfamiliar, it was embedded in how they operated, how they had always operated, and now they were seeing the cost of that approach in real time. Kevin's screen updated again, another confirmation tied to the board intervention, and his voice came out almost under his breath. "The vote is queued," he said, and that shifted everything again, because this was no longer just explanation, it was action. Rachel turned slightly toward the screen, then back to Malik, her expression now fully controlled, but no longer dismissive. "You initiated a board vote," she said, and Malik did not deny it. "I initiated accountability," he corrected, his tone still calm, still precise. "The vote is just the mechanism." Silence followed, but it was no longer confusion, it was understanding forming in real time, and for the first time since this began, Rachel Whitmore did not try to reclaim the room with authority, because she understood something deeper now. Authority had already shifted, and the outcome they were about to face had been decided long before they ever realized there was a decision to be made. The word accountability did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise, like something that had been waiting to be said long before this room existed, and no one rushed to challenge it, not because they agreed, but because they understood that the system itself had already aligned behind it. And Rachel Whitmore stood there for a moment, her posture still composed, her expression controlled. But something beneath that surface had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by tone or authority alone. "Then let us be clear," she said finally, her voice calm but sharpened by intent. "What exactly is being voted on?" Malik did not look away from her, did not hesitate, because the question was expected, necessary, and already answered before it was asked. "Executive leadership review," he said, each word deliberate. "Performance, conduct, and risk exposure tied to decision-making at the highest level." The phrasing was clinical, almost detached, but the meaning was not abstract. It was immediate, and everyone in the room understood exactly where that focus would land. Kevin's screen updated again, the board interface now fully active, names appearing, voting channels opening, each member's access confirmed in real time, and his voice came out lower than before, almost careful. "The vote window is live," he said, and that single sentence shifted the atmosphere from tension into inevitability. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands coming together in front of him as if trying to anchor himself in something stable. "This is moving too fast," he said, not as a protest, but as a realization, because processes like this were not supposed to happen within hours. They were meant to take days, weeks, layers of review, but Malik's presence alone had accelerated everything beyond the normal pace. Malik responded without raising his voice. It is only fast if you were not prepared for it, he said, and that distinction landed quietly but firmly, because preparation implied intent, and intent implied this was never a reaction, it was execution. Rachel's gaze shifted briefly toward the screen, watching as the board members' indicators turned active one by one, each light representing a decision about to be made. And then she looked back at Malik, her expression no longer dismissive, no longer resistant, but focused, calculating even now. You structured this long before today, she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and Malik gave a slight nod, acknowledging the accuracy without elaboration. You walked into that room already knowing how this would end, she continued, her tone steady, but now there was something else beneath it, something closer to recognition, and Malik's response did not come with pride, only clarity. I walked into that room to see if it needed to end this way, he said. That sentence changed the weight of everything that came before it, because it reframed the entire sequence, not as inevitability, but as choice. The room absorbed that slowly, because it meant the outcome they were facing now had not been guaranteed, it had been triggered. Kevin's fingers hovered over the keyboard as another update appeared, the first vote submitted, then another, the system recording each one without emotion, without hesitation, just precise execution of authority. Votes are coming in, he said quietly, and no one asked for numbers yet, because numbers would make it final in a way that could not be undone. Rachel inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her posture adjusting just slightly, not collapsing, not retreating, but recalibrating, because even now, even here, she refused to lose composure. And if the outcome aligns with your expectation, she said, her voice measured, what happens next? Malik's eyes remained steady, his answer immediate, not rehearsed, but certain. Then the company corrects its leadership, he said, and resets its standards. The words were simple, but they carried finality, because correction implied removal, and reset implied change that could not be reversed by preference or opinion. Around the table, no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they did completely. The system continued to update, silent but decisive, and Kevin finally looked up from the screen, his voice quieter than it had been all day. Majority threshold is approaching, he said, and that was the moment when anticipation turned into certainty, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Rachel did not look at the screen this time. She looked at Malik, and for the first time since this began, there was no attempt to challenge, no attempt to redirect, only understanding forming behind controlled composure. Because she realized something that had not been clear before, this was never about proving power, it was about revealing it, and the moment it was revealed, everything else followed exactly as it was designed to. The room did not erupt when the threshold was reached. It shifted, quietly, definitively, like a line had been crossed that no one could step back over, and Kevin's eyes remained fixed on the screen as the final indicator changed, his voice steady but unmistakably lower than before. Majority confirmed, he said, and the words carried through the boardroom with a weight that did not need volume to be understood. No one clapped. No one reacted outwardly. Because this was not a moment for celebration or shock, it was a moment of consequence. Rachel Whitmore did not look at the screen. She did not need to. She had already read the room, already understood what the silence meant, and she remained standing at the head of the table, her posture still composed, her expression controlled, but now there was no illusion left to maintain, no authority left to assert over what had already been decided. Malik Thompson did not move either. He sat where he had positioned himself, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, not watching the screen, not watching the votes, but watching the outcome unfold in the only place that mattered, the room itself. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if the air had finally caught up to him. That is it, he said quietly, not asking, not confirming, just stating what everyone already knew. Kevin nodded once, his hands resting still now. Because the system had nothing left to process. The vote is finalized, he said. Executive leadership has been formally reviewed and removed. The last word did not echo. It settled, like everything else that had happened in that room. Precise, irreversible, complete. Rachel's eyes closed for the briefest moment, not in defeat, not in denial, but in acknowledgement, because she understood something now that had not been clear before. This was never about speed or surprise. It was about structure, and she had misread it entirely. When she opened her eyes again, she looked directly at Malik, not with resistance, not with dismissal, but with clarity. "You did not come here to invest," she said, her voice calm, stripped of everything except truth. Malik met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he replied. "I came here to evaluate." The distinction landed with quiet force, because it reframed everything that had happened. The meeting, the rejection, the removal. None of it had been about him needing access. It had been about them being tested. Around the table, the board members remained still, not because they lacked reaction, but because they understood the weight of what had just taken place, not just a change in leadership, but a shift in standard, in expectation, in accountability. Kevin glanced once more at the system, as if expecting something else to appear, but it remained steady, unchanged, because the action had already been completed. "Next steps are being issued," he said softly, reading from the interface. "Interim leadership designation, pending." Daniel straightened slightly, his voice careful now, measured. "That would fall to the primary stakeholder," he said, and this time, no one questioned it. All eyes moved, not dramatically, but naturally, toward Malik. He did not react immediately. He did not lean forward, did not claim the space with words or gestures, because he did not need to. The position had already been defined by the structure he controlled, by the vote that had just passed, by the authority that had been revealed. Rachel remained where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture still strong, but now grounded. In something different, not control, but acceptance. "Then say it clearly," she said, her voice steady, directed at Malik, not as a challenge, but as a requirement, because clarity was the only thing left that mattered. Malik looked at her for a moment, then around the table, acknowledging each person without needing to speak to them individually. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, precise, and final, effective immediately. "I assume executive control." The room did not react with shock. It absorbed the statement, because it aligned perfectly with everything that had already happened. Kevin's screen updated one last time, confirming the transition, and he nodded once. "Control transfer confirmed," he said quietly. Rachel exhaled slowly, then straightened fully, her composure intact, her presence still strong, even in transition, because leadership did not disappear in a moment, it shifted. She stepped back slightly from the head of the table, not dramatically, not reluctantly, just enough to acknowledge what had already been decided. Malik did not stand. He did not move into her space. He simply remained where he was, because the position did not require motion, it required presence. And in that moment, the room no longer belonged to assumption, to perception, or to bias. It belonged to truth, revealed without noise, enforced without argument, and accepted without question. No one rushed to leave the room after the confirmation, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because they understood that what had just happened was not a moment you simply walked away from. It was something you absorbed, something that redefined the space itself, and Malik Thompson remained seated for a few seconds longer, not out of hesitation, but out of control, allowing the silence to settle fully before he moved forward. "We proceed," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying a different weight, not as an outsider observing, but as the one responsible for what came next, and that subtle shift changed everything in the room. Kevin straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting to the new structure without needing instruction, his screen already updating to reflect the transition. "All systems are now aligned under your authority," he said, and Malik gave a slight nod, acknowledging the efficiency without needing to comment on it. Rachel Whitmore did not leave. She remained standing just off the head of the table, her posture still composed, her expression controlled, but now grounded in clarity rather than resistance. And when she spoke again, her voice carried no trace of earlier dismissal, only precision. "What is your first directive?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of process, because regardless of position, execution still followed structure. Malik turned his attention toward the center of the table, his gaze moving briefly across each board member, not to assess, but to acknowledge. Because accountability did not end with one decision, it extended across the system. "We begin with internal review," he said, his tone measured, not just of leadership, but of decision patterns, approval thresholds, and behavioral indicators that led to this outcome. The phrasing was deliberate, because this was not about a single moment. It was about the pattern that allowed that moment to happen. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the directive. "Full audit," he said, more to confirm than to question, and Malik responded with a slight inclination of his head. "Complete and transparent," he clarified. "No selective reporting, no filtered outcomes." The room adjusted again, not dramatically, but noticeably, because transparency at that level meant exposure, and exposure meant accountability beyond comfort. Kevin began entering commands, initiating the audit protocols, his movements precise, efficient, as if he had always operated under this expectation, even if it had not been enforced before. Audit sequence initiated, he confirmed quietly. Malik then shifted his focus slightly, his gaze returning to Rachel, not confrontational, not dismissive, but direct, because what came next required clarity. "You built a system that moved quickly," he said, his voice steady. "But speed without verification creates risk." Rachel did not interrupt. She did not defend. She listened, because the statement was not an attack, it was an assessment. "You relied on instinct where process should have existed," Malik continued. "And today, that instinct made the wrong call." The room did not react outwardly, but the weight of those words settled across every person present, because they all recognized the truth in it. Rachel inhaled slowly, then nodded once, a small, controlled motion, not agreement in defeat, but acknowledgement in understanding. "Then the system changes," she said, her voice steady, and Malik met that with a slight nod of his own, because that was the only acceptable outcome. Around the table, the board members began to shift into action, not with urgency, but with purpose, because the direction was clear now, not reactive, not chaotic, but structured. Kevin's screen continued to populate with audit parameters, timelines, access logs, and for the first time since the sequence began, the movement in the room felt aligned, not fragmented. Malik stood then, not abruptly, not to dominate the space, but to mark the transition fully, and as he did, every eye followed naturally, not out of obligation, but because authority, once revealed, did not need to demand attention, it held it. "This is not a reset for appearance," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "It is a reset for standard." The words did not rise in volume, but they carried finality, because they defined what came next in a way no one could misunderstand. Rachel remained where she stood, her posture still strong, her presence still grounded, and as she looked at Malik, there was no longer any attempt to measure him against expectation, because expectation had already failed, replaced now by reality. The room, once defined by assumption, now operated on something else entirely: clarity, accountability, and a standard that had just been enforced without noise, without argument, but with precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The room did not return to what it had been, not after the audit was initiated, not after authority had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Malik Thompson stood at the center of it now, not as someone who had taken control through force or volume, but as someone who had revealed what control actually looked like when it was grounded in structure, in patience, in clarity, and the difference was not loud, it was absolute. The board members moved with purpose now, not rushed, not scattered, but aligned, because direction had been redefined and expectation had been reset, and Kevin's screen continued to populate with layers of information that had once been invisible, now exposed, now accountable, every decision traceable, every assumption measurable. Rachel Whitmore remained present, not at the head of the table anymore, but not removed from the room either, because leadership did not disappear when authority shifted, it transformed, and she stood there with a posture that still carried strength, but now that strength came from awareness rather than certainty. Malik glanced once more across the table, not to assert presence, but to confirm alignment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm precision that had defined every moment since he entered. "What happened here today was not a disruption," he said. "It was a correction." The words settled differently than anything before them, because they framed the entire sequence not as conflict, but as necessary adjustment, something that had been overdue, something that had been avoided until it could no longer be ignored. Daniel nodded slightly, his earlier confidence replaced now with something more grounded, more deliberate, because he understood that correction did not end with one decision. It required consistency moving forward. Kevin continued working, but even his movements had changed, more intentional now, because the system he operated within had been redefined at its core. Malik's gaze shifted briefly toward Rachel, not confrontational, not dismissive, but direct, and there was no need for accusation, no need for repetition of what had already been proven, because the lesson itself had already taken shape in the outcome. "You did not lose control in this room," he said, his voice steady. "You lost it the moment you decided who belonged here before you knew who they were." The statement did not rise, did not echo, but it carried a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. Rachel absorbed it without interruption, without defense, because for the first time, she saw the full structure of the moment, not just the decision, but the pattern behind it, the assumption that had shaped it, and the consequence that followed. She nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more weight than anything she had said earlier, because it was not agreement, it was recognition. Around the room, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that this was the part that mattered, not the vote, not the transition, but the meaning behind it. Malik took a step back then, not to leave, not to withdraw, but to allow the room to exist under the new standard without needing his constant presence, because real authority did not need to remain at the center. It reshaped the space and let it hold. "From this point forward," he said, his tone unchanged, "decisions will be made with verification, not assumption, with process, not instinct, and with awareness that power does not always look the way you expect it to." The words carried through the room with quiet finality, not as instruction alone, but as foundation, something that would define every action that followed. Outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place high above it. But inside that boardroom, something had changed permanently, not through conflict, not through noise, but through truth revealed at the exact moment it could no longer be denied. And as the room settled into its new structure, one thing remained clear: the most powerful move had not been the takeover. It had been the silence that came before it, the moment when a man chose not to argue, not to prove, but to let the system reveal itself, and in doing so, expose exactly what needed to change.